Harry Dubois is a drug-addicted, bulbous, gin blossom-nosed alcoholic on the verge of a complete mental breakdown that wakes up in a thrashed hotel room with blood on his clothes in a rundown port district of a failing city, smelling like Dave Attell's jeans the morning after the filming of an Insomniac episode, mixed with cheap aftershave and the ever-present smell of the sea. Oh, and he can't remember anything that happened. Given all of that, Harry is supposed to conduct a murder investigation. And that's just what you learn about the main character in the first 60 seconds of Disco Elysium, minutes before he tells a random woman, "I want to have fun with you." A masterpiece of a game to wit, I don't think there's been anything like it before or since, and I don't think there ever will be again, because the people behind the creation of this game not only lost ownership of their studio and the artistic collective they started that led to this game, but they also lost control, not only of the studio, but in one founder's case, control of their mind. Hi everyone. My name is Onepeg, and this is the story of how Disco Elysium was lost. If you ever end up liking this video or any of my other stories in gaming, you can find me live every day over at twitch.tv/Onepeg, or maybe sub the channel here. It really does matter. Disco Elysium is one of the wildest stories that has probably ever been written in the world of gaming. I don't mean just in the case of the game itself, because the RPG is an amazing mix of the internal dialogues and conflicts that can occur in someone racked by their past deeds, continued mistakes, current severe mental illness, addiction, and trying to do the right thing in spite of those vices, while simultaneously waxing and waning poetically on the political dichotomy that exists between communist and capitalist ideologies, all of that packed into a game that can be boiled down to the phrase, "You're a detective trying to solve a murder," but also because ultimately the association of artists integral to this studio got scattered like Namekian Dragon Balls after investors in the studio scammed the devs so badly it even drove one of them into a mental institution and would lead those same devs to sue the company they founded. At least, that is if you believe one side of this story. The other side paints a picture where key players took advantage of their position and milked a studio they were no longer actively participating in for not only income, but also assets they had attempted to steal and were fired for it. We're not talking about just any game here. We're talking about a game that had a total production budget of around $5 million as a high cost estimate, true indie game studio, that grossed over $200 million, that won massive awards and accolades from every single awards provider in existence between 2019 and 2020 for things like Best RPG, Best Narrative, Best Indie Game, Best Writing, and even PC Game of the Year from places like PC Gamer and Golden Joystick that spurned a cult global following and even led to its own line of clothing. This small studio called Zom, comprised entirely from young minds in the small Eastern European country of Estonia, created something gamers couldn't put down. A truly independent developer created something great, created primarily from the mind of one man that had been thinking of and building the land of Elysium since the late 90s and early 2000s when he was still a teenager. And what felt like a time when the development team should have been taking a victory lap, a time when the studio should have been working on expanding this world of Elysium, leveraging this high of highs, the studio seemingly began to come crashing down around them. The primary creative mind behind the game, its writing, its setting, and its story is this guy, Robert Kurvitz. Kurvitz is a writer and musician that back in 2013 published a book called Sacred and Terrible Air, a story set in a land called Elysium, in which three men, 20 years after the disappearance of their classmates, go on a journey determined to find them. The book was published via an association that Kurvitz helped to start with the assistance from a very controversial figure in Estonia, a man by the name of Kaur Kender. Kender was a novelist in Estonia that ended up the subject of a massive court battle regarding free speech due to a novel Kender wrote, in which the protagonist committed extremely graphic, violent, and sexual acts not only against women, but also children, the protagonist of the book. Kender stated this was a literary work that, while graphic, brought attention to the barbarity and dichotomy of humanity, but the Estonian government disagreed, calling the book child pornography. Ultimately, Kender was cleared of the charges, with the judge stating that the work was not pornographic but literary in nature, yet the stain of his name still remains. Kender encouraged Kurvitz to write his book, which turned out to be a commercial failure, by the way, although it got good reviews, selling a mere 1,000 copies that drove Kurvitz into what he described as a deep alcoholism. Kurvitz credits Kender with convincing him to write and create a video game in the world of Elysium instead, and the idea for what ultimately became Disco Elysium was born. Kurvitz's right hand and best friend is this guy, Alexander Rostov. Rostov and Kurvitz met when they were more or less kids, which is true for an awful lot of the people that work for ZOM. Rostov being 17 and Kurvitz being about 20. They were in an Estonian punk, primarily male anarchist group of high school dropouts called the Overcoats. Their motto? Today we drink tea, tomorrow we rule the world. Kurvitz had Elysium in his head for years, and around this point in time is when Elysium started to take root. His love for storytelling would captivate his friends as he ran Dungeons & Dragons campaigns that eventually turned into storyboarding and narrating and building this world of Elysium instead, brick by brick. Sometime around 2008 or 2009, Kurvitz, Rostov, and some other members of the Overcoats, key ones being Martin Lugia, Helen Hindpair, who was recruited to join at the age of 14 back in 2008, and some others, create the ZOM Cultural Association. The goal of the association was to be an artistic platform for expression, critique, and intellectual exploration. This association was the publisher of Kurvitz's book. Back in 2013, members of the group formed a prog rock band called Ultra Melonhool. The association seemingly was a group of young dudes that wanted to shake up Estonia via art and writing that focused on counterculture, anarchism, critiquing modern capitalism, and occasionally getting into fistfights with other associations. Honestly, this just sounds like the punk movement in New York City ended up meeting the art district. But some of this artwork, the writing styles of its members, and the stylistic nature of the association would ultimately set the tone for Disco Elysium, with some of Rostov's earliest work in the association setting the artistic style of what we see now in disco. The name ZOM, according to an interview with Kurvitz, was a stylistic view of a word that looked badass, quote-unquote, reminiscent of well-known, popular, and hell, even legendary logos like CBGB, or in the case of the slash through the middle of the word, the band AC/DC. But considering the entire world built around Disco Elysium and its stories primarily came from Kurvitz and the association's head, the literal Russian translation of the word ZOM, meaning for the mind or from the mind, absolutely tracks here. From everything I've read, researched, and seen, Disco Elysium appears to be mainly the product of an overworked skeleton crew of core people that on the onset had no idea how to make a video game, much less fund it. The time between when this project began to its release into what was then deemed a post-launch final cut of the game boils down to one word: chaotic. Because the core mind behind Disco Elysium was comprised of artists and not business people, they turned to Kender, who had, as the rumor goes, sold a Ferrari that at one time had belonged to Dolph Lundgren in order to fund the initial studio. Kender sought out to find investors to raise the necessary funds in addition to this Ferrari sale, and found it originally in one of the richest men in the country, a guy by the name of Margus Linnamäe, in a split of 1783 between Kender and Linnamäe. Once Linnamäe was found, Kender then decided to sell off his shares of the company to a different investor that we're going to hear a lot about in the coming minutes, a man by the name of Ilmar Kompas. Kompas owns a venture capital firm called Koa Capital. The K-O in Koa being for him, Kompas, and the Ha being for his, at the time, 50% shareholder and business partner, Thomas Havel. Havel is no longer a partner in this investment firm, though, because of yet another scandal. What are we up to now? I think this is our second of this video. Havel, who, by the way, was voted Estonia's most stylish man in 2002, was integral in what is now referred to as the Baku affair. In 2014, Havel and two other men were convicted of investment fraud, where they had pitched to several wealthy Estonian investors an idea of buying a large amount of underdeveloped land in Baku, Azerbaijan, developing it, and then selling it for a large profit. But this turned out to be all smoke and mirrors, and Havel was ordered to pay 20 million euros in damages to those affected, but somehow, thanks to the Court of Appeals, was able to avoid jail time. Now, the EU is known for having rather fluid borders. People are able to come and go between them and relocate with minimal effort and paperwork. But each member country obviously has its own laws and rules. Because of this, people sometimes participate in what is known as bankruptcy tourism. Essentially, if someone ends up in dire monetary straits, they have the ability to move into one of the other member countries, declare themselves bankrupt, and none of the debts they had prior tends to travel with them. Havel, having become the subject of this judgment, moves to Latvia and declares bankruptcy. This will be an important piece of this story in a bit. Also, immediately prior to this judgment being realized, Havel signs over his controlling share of the capital firm to his then business partner, Compass, so as to not have those assets left behind with his name on them either. What other small amount of personal assets Havel has are seized by the Estonian government, but it is believed at the time of Disco Elysium's release, Havel still owes tens of millions of euros worth of restitution and debts. I promise you this is going to make sense. In 2016, roughly 1 year into the full production of Disco Elysium, which this time went by another name, No Truce with the Furies, the company known as ZOM Studio is 83% owned by Liname and 17% owned by Compass. Notice nowhere in this studio's ownership are any of the ZOM Cultural Association members. Kurvitz, Rostov, Hinper, none of them have any ownership of their own project. But there was a beacon of hope. There was a clause in the shareholder agreement that said if Disco ended up meeting certain sales targets, there would be a stock buyback from the company, and the shares of ownership for that stock would be redistributed amongst some of the other members. And that is what happened in 2020. In 2020, Linmay's share percentages get sold down to 48%, with Rostov, Kurvitz, and now Kender, who sold off his original ownership, regain it at some 10% each, and Ilmar Compass rounds out the last bit at 22%. He got his end bumped just a little bit. Also at this point in time, many of the core members of the studio, Kurvitz, Hinper, and Rostov being among the primary folks that make the move, with Kar Kender, create a London-based office in order to gain access to a larger pool of available talent, and because London was a better recognized country to house an IP like Disco Elysium than, say, Estonia, Disco ends up moving to the UK along with these members. They create a company called ZOM UK Limited to house the Disco Elysium IP, which is owned in even 20% shares between Rostov, Kurvitz, Kender, Compass, and a fifth company called Yes Sir, No Sir Limited, owned by a woman named Anu Ryman. Ryman is a new face, and to Rostov and Kurvitz, they're not really sure who she is at first. Ryman owned a capital investment company that invested in a lot of Estonian businesses, and just so happened to be very close to a name we've heard before in this video, Tanis Havel. As it turns out, her and Tanis Havel are romantically involved. She, as the sole owner of Yes Sir, No Sir Limited, also owns a company in Estonia called Studio 38, where ZOM had been paying her firm tens of thousands of euros per month in consulting fees. So why does this matter? Well, when Compass bought into ZOM, he hired Tanis Havel as a producer for the game. In fact, Havel is listed in the credits of the game as being the executive producer for Disco Elysium. Now to date, I haven't found anyone that knows exactly what Studio 38 or Yes Sir, No Sir Limited did or has done for ZOM as a company. But according to Kender in testimony given in court, ZOM was paying Studio 38 a significant sum of money monthly as a way to hide Havel's real income. That way they could ensure that he doesn't have to pay back his Estonian debt. That is, of course, up until sometime in 2022 when it appears the payments ceased. So what's that, scandal number 3 now? So for those of you trying to follow along at home, we now have 2 corporate entities, ZOM Studio in Estonia and ZOM UK Limited as a subsidiary, but a subsidiary that houses the IP to Disco Elysium and some other monetary assets. Back in Estonia, Linmay, who has his 48% shareholding, suddenly sells off his ownership to Ilmar Compass, who nearly overnight ends up now as the sole controlling shareholder of ZOM Studio at 69.1%. Kurvitz and Rostov, they claim, are left in the dark regarding this transaction and state they only found out about this happening after it had already concluded. And this is where things start to get shady, as if they haven't already. According to a lawsuit that Kender initially filed and then later backed out for reasons, the deal Compass signed stated he had to pay 1.5 million euros up front and another 3 million euros to follow. Compass, out of his own pocket, coughs up 300,000 euros of his own funds and takes a 1.2 million euro loan from the UK studio. Kender then claims that Compass bought the assets for another IP that the studio had begun work on. And I use the term work here loosely because it's reported it was some pencil drawings and a wad of text on paper from his studio for £1 British. So then he now owns this IP personally. He then turns right back around again and sells those same slips of paper back to his company for 4.8 million euros. Kender then says Compass used these funds to pay back Lin May's remaining 3 million euros for the sale of his shares, and then the 1.2 million euro loan back to the UK studio. I imagine whatever was left went back into Compass' own pockets so he could get back the 300k plus, hell, a VIG or two, why not? Kurvitz and Rostov claim they had no knowledge of this transaction until after it was completed. They were never involved in any conversations. They were never offered the ability to maybe buy out some of these shares themselves, which means, if true, this whole thing stinks of fraud, which is what Kurvitz and Rostov in part sued Zom's studio over. Now, at this point, you have to remember, the studio at this point had moved operations partially into the UK. It's now 2020 into 2021. These guys had already been standing on stage in 2018 and 2019 accepting all of these awards. The game had already blown up, and they were looking toward moving to a director's cut. The ultimate idea behind the director's cut was to add a little bit more, I guess, flavor into the game. They decided they wanted to voice act all of the lines of dialogue possible, and that was going to be a huge undertaking. They added some political vision quests with ideologies of communism, fascism, moralism, and ultra-liberalism to give your character the decision to move in one direction or another. There are art galleries, enhanced visuals, and the ability to have different wardrobes, clothing options, and the like. This was all being done under the guise of wanting something that was going to be a bit more polished than the original raw feel of Disco's original release. But remember, this director's cut was being produced after the game had already won all of its accolades. And in some ways, the people that were critical of this director's cut idea were kind of saying it's not broke, why fix it? But as these seemingly back-channel business dealings are being going on with shareholder arrangement changes and all of this weird money changing hands in the background, the director's cut is supposed to be going full steam ahead. And that's when things start to get troublesome. So to recap the story so far, we have a wildly successful game made by what appear to be literary genius in the gaming space, whom have little to no control of their own thoughts put to paper, while they themselves work absurd hours alongside a skeleton crew of devs comprised mostly of other members of the Zom Cultural Association, with some really shady back-end deals by a larger shareholder in order to gain operational control of the business, and all the while, this larger shareholder is slipping money under the table to his best friend's long-term girlfriend in an effort to help him evade authorities from collecting their owed debt because of fraud, while simultaneously being given billing as one of the primary executive producers. Sure, this all seems perfectly fine. What could possibly go wrong? But what about the other side of this coin? Were Kurvitz, Rostov, and Hinper overworked going into 2019 and 2020? Did they do all of the work? After all, Kurvitz stated that he himself wrote some 500,000 words worth of script for this game, half the total word count, even though Hinper is credited with being the primary writer for the director's cut. But this wasn't the opinion of everyone at the studio. 3 years ago, the YouTube channel People Make Games did a large investigative piece on Disco Elysium and its people, and some of them had some things to say contrary to what the gamer blog media would have you believe at the time. Argo Tulik, a lead writer of Disco and one of the original members of the Zom Cultural Association, speaks about Kurvitz with reverence.
Some of the world building stuff and some of the concepts in there are just mind-blowing. I think Robert has this uncanny ability to conceptualize things that already exist in a way that they seem completely fresh and new.
Tulik was someone that joined Zom as a teenager, back before it was even Zom, back in 2001, during the early Overcoats days. In fact, here's a picture of him with a mohawk. When asked about Kurvitz and his involvement in the game and its writing, though, Tulik balks and says this is inaccurate. But when asked about whether or not he's said anything to Kurvitz about it, Tulik balks again.
Have you ever spoken to him about how it feels to read that as one of the other writers on the...
No, I haven't. Honestly, I don't think I've ever been in this position with him where I had the inner strength to say that.
And it seems that Kurvitz wasn't much in the way of having leadership qualities. From just about all sides, Kurvitz is overwhelmingly described as charismatic, imaginative, innovative even, but being a leader was not among them. It seemed that rather than being part of a team and attempting to guide people, he would instead play the part of dictator. Here's Argo again.
It was quite often that Robert took one look at the whole hub in a dialogue, like 4 days worth of work, zoomed in on it, said, nah, it doesn't work, it's bullshit, and deleted it.
Kaspar Tomzalu, a lead artist at Zom that was, again, friends with Rostov since they were teenagers back in the late 90s and early 2000s, kind of a common theme here, right? Said that there seemed to be preferential treatment given to several people working alongside Kurvitz and Rostov. A closer-knit group of friends, a group inside of a group. And he felt as though he was being left on the outside and not included in future works from the team, even though they promised him he would be. Going so far as to even have purchased a ticket to the UK, only being told not to bother just days before his trip was supposed to happen. Now, these are some of the key reasons why the ownership of Zom ultimately decided that Kurvitz and Rostov needed to be terminated, with Hindper to follow just 6 days later. The narrative was Kurvitz was creating a toxic work environment, rife with not only verbal abuse and bullying, but also misogyny and sexism, in addition to the mismanagement, according to legal filings made by Zom Studio and Havel. This is in addition to an accusation of attempting to steal the Disco Elysium IP, but we'll get to that. There's an old saying in Hollywood, and by extension the visual and written arts world, famously attributed to the American author William Faulkner, who said, "Kill your darlings," which means you've got to get used to people saying your work is terrible and throwing it in the trash. For Zom and this group of friends, this side of Kurvitz may have been something they had not been used to seeing. After all of Kurvitz's own writing was something he would throw away himself. And by their own admission, they were all overworked, broke, facing deadlines, looming investors looking for their due and proper, and they were crunching for months. So Kurvitz being an asshole? Sure, I could see that. Writers that come up through a cultural association and not in a writing room at a TV network or otherwise, suddenly being told their work is shit and not being used to that? I could see that too. Tulik even says as much in his PMG interview, stating, had it not been for this time working alongside Kurvitz, he never would have been tempered into the writer he is today, able to take criticism from others far better now than he ever could back then. Okay, so Kurvitz wasn't very nice when it came to the cutting room, but misogyny and sexism? That's pretty serious. Usually when you hear about something like this, your mind automatically goes to the worst case scenario. Blizzard Entertainment and the Bill Cosby suite kind of shit. Zom must have had something pretty serious, right? Well, Thomas Havel, the guy that was found guilty of embezzling 20 million euros, his primary example for Kurvitz's blatant sexism comes down to a call that Havel was having with Helen Hindper about the director's cut of Disco Elysium. Kurvitz, who had been taken off of the Disco Elysium writing team to partially focus on the voice acting part of director's cut and primarily focus on the creation of Disco Elysium 2, walked into the room while Helen was mid-call, took the headset off of her head, and injected himself into the meeting to tell Havel what he thought. Havel fired off an email to Kurvitz saying how unprofessional and basically sexist the entire interaction was, but Hindper denies that this was an issue. She herself and Kurvitz had been in a relationship for many, many years by this point, predating Zom Studio even, and Kurvitz was just being Kurvitz. If I told you that this was the only example that the studio had in regard to Kurvitz, would you believe me? Because I'm not kidding when I tell you that this is the only example that they had of misogyny from Kurvitz. But as it turns out, there are other examples of sexism. In the 3 years since the PMG documentary was made, there have been lawsuits and layoffs. Two of those people were Argo Tulik, who towed the line during the PMG interview, and another writer, Dora Klinzik, who joined Zom in 2022, who compared it to being born in Yugoslavia in the 90s, she said. You've just missed the party and now all you get is the bloodshed. Both of these people decided to speak with Sports Illustrated back in February of 2024, where Klinzik said people making what was supposed to be the successor to Disco, codenamed Project X7, were subjected to months of crunch, burnout, and conflict. Except this time, Kurvitz wasn't in the studio. He had already been fired. Odd. Doesn't seem nearly as harmonious as what the studio would have had you believe now that Kurvitz was gone. Argo interjects again and says he knows of at least 5 women who've left or been made to leave, naming Thomas Havel as a major factor. There are 0 women in creative leadership, he says, and very few women in leadership positions in general. Another female source in the same article, not named, said they felt the studio didn't treat women the same and their work wasn't as valued. Oh, and speaking of Helen Hindper on the phone, here's a phone call she describes.
Everything seemed to be smooth sailing until I hear 2 weeks before the end of August that the game now has a release date, and this is in March, and that the writing lock, like entire lock, so that we don't touch it anymore, is in 2 weeks. And I hear it just, in a meeting with everyone else, Gauds just throws it out. And then I go and just write in Slack to Gaur, ask like, hey, what's happening? How we had like a misunderstanding? How come I'm only now hearing about the release date? And he says that, this is all his fault, but that, I can just give him like new dates when I think like everything can be finished and editing can be locked so that it can be given over to the VO department and, everything will be fine.
I feel like there should be a moment here where Morgan Freeman suddenly pops in as a narrator and says something like, but it turns out it wouldn't be fine. Sorry, that's a really bad Morgan Freeman impression. Because at this point, shit hits the fan. Here's Helen again in regard to the deadline, talking about a call she got from Havel, Thomas Havel, the guy that embezzled 20 million euros. And remember, Kurvitz is not part of this conversation. He's not in the room.
I get a message from Dennis that says, hey, do you have a time for a call as soon as possible? I was excited. I was like, yes, let's have a call. I'm ready as soon as you are. Dennis just starts screaming at me. He just said that people like you are not meant to be leaders. You don't have what it takes to be a leader. I honestly thought that he was just firing me. That's what it felt like. I remember I took off my headphones and another writer who had stepped into the room asked who had screamed at you, because even through my headphones, it was just, you could hear that someone was screaming at me.
Back to this Sports Illustrated interview. During this same interview, Argo says, and I'm quoting here, it's the people on the top, the MFers in sailing shoes, pay attention to that bit, that effed Harry, effed Kim, effed Robert, Rostov, Helen, Olga, Cash, effed Elysium, effed you and me too. They are not artists, they are professional effers. But what did he mean about sailing shoes? Turns out the heads of Disco Elysium had a sailing team. Remember that 20% shareholder ownership of Zom UK Limited was Yes Sir, No Sir, owned by Thomas Havel's partner? Well, that's also the name of a competition sailboat with Harry on the sail, and a team of 5 people needed to sail it. 2 of those 5 people, Thomas Havel and his partner Anu Ryman. So the MFers in sailing shoes would be Thomas Havel and his lady on the take. The one getting paid 50,000 euros a month so that Thomas could hide money away from his debts. Not for nothing, but if there was going to be an example of someone devaluing a woman's contribution after a repeatedly admitted mess up by one of her male superiors, if only to then have the producer of the studio call her up and scream about how she's not a leader to the effect that someone down the hall can hear it, and then years later, the culture didn't change to where a crunch is still happening and women are still saying that one guy in particular is the problem, I would probably have some questions for that guy, as opposed to the guy that snatched a headset off his girlfriend's head to tell this apparent asshole boss what he thought, especially if my boss was someone that got convicted of embezzlement to the tune of 20 million euros. What blows my mind about this part of the PMG interviews is that at no point does the documentarian take this piece that Hinper describes to mention that this was a stronger example of sexism than anything that Kurvitz got accused of. And considering that in 2024, when the final remaining members of the original Zom Cultural Association finally left Zom Studio, making it now completely devoid of the talent that started Disco Elysium, having those people say the sexism still existed? Yeah, the whole Kurvitz is a sexist and her house is much better now doesn't seem to hold water when the internal culture never changed. And as time has gone on, more and more people start pointing the finger at someone else, causing everything to erode. Thomas Havel. Now, is it possible that Kurvitz is a sexist? Yeah, it's possible, although there really isn't any evidence for that. Is it possible and much more likely that Havel, at best, is just as bad and likely worse than anything that Kurvitz was being accused of? In my opinion, absolutely. I should also say here, just in case you haven't gotten the sarcastic tone in my voice, that I do not believe Kurvitz to be a sexist or a misogynist. From everything I've seen, it appears to be more so that he's just the typical haughty, self-assured artist charmer in public settings and the visionary no bullshit type of boss that's hard to work with due to his need for perfection when in his element. There are people everywhere like this. Gordon Ramsay, Steve Jobs, Stanley Kubrick, Prince. These types of personalities are seen everywhere in the art and business world, and they get loved for it regardless. Artists like Kurvitz are likely insufferable, but they're equally insufferable to everyone. And those that follow him do so because they believe he has vision that they don't, and they are loved for being the artists they are despite their flaws. And of course, while no single person will ever be fully capable of making a video game from concept to publishing or any other work of art at this scale for that matter, the vision for Disco was absolutely rooted in Kurvitz's brain. Now, I'm not saying that Kurvitz is fucking Prince, okay, but you get the idea. Even more recently, Argo Tulik and Dora Klinzik have popped up again. In December of 2024, Tulik posted, of all things, a GoFundMe, where he laid out in vivid, impassioned detail about how after he was laid off from Zom, he began working at a studio upon its founding called Longdu Games as its narrative designer. It was run by this guy, Riaz Mula, a South African tech entrepreneur. Citing ethical concerns with Riaz Mula himself, Tulik left this position and began to create a new project with Dora Klinzik called Summer Eternal. There's a website right now that you can go and visit. But this project, like Disco, may also end up doomed, as Mula is currently suing Tulik over breach of do not compete clauses in his contract to the extent that Tulik is asking for financial assistance from the public in order to mount his legal defense, which has not gone in his favor, and he's been forbidden from touching anything related to Summer Eternal until at least April of 2025, because as he states, his lawyers didn't have enough time to prepare by the time that he was able to scrape the money together to afford them. Even more recently, and as of this recording, I mean as of 3 weeks ago, Tulik and Klinzik have popped up again in, and I cannot make this up, an over 16-hour-long two-part podcast where they talk about an awful lot of stuff that went wrong with Zom, most of which I've already covered in this historical look. But if the studio didn't seem scummy enough, remember at the start of this video I mentioned the clothing line that was spawned as a result of the game? That clothing line still exists. The web domain Zom Atelier has clothing reminiscent of the game for sale, like Kim Kitsuragi's jacket for a measly €399. Or how about this plastic bag made of Dyneema fabric, which the website lists as having the highest tear resistance and tensile strength of any composite fabric to date. That neat little plastic bag, €159. Maybe Uber fans could see sense in the cost of some of these items, but I do not. Yeah, the game is great, and the story is one of the greats if you look at the historical works of RPG games, but €700 just to LARP as Kim? No. If someone was going to cosplay one of these characters, they just do what most other cosplayers do and make it themselves for significantly less than whatever these guys are trying to charge for it. It's just crazy. Okay, on to the last reason why Kurvitz was fired by Ilmar Compass: attempted theft of Zom IP. Aside from an on-camera testimony from one of the people that was towing the line at the time of the documentary made almost 2 years ago, there hasn't been any material proof that I've been able to find that actually tied Kurvitz to having made strides to take anything out of Zom. In fact, the only leeching of this IP in its studio that I could find has solely been at the hands of Ilmar Compass, the CEO, and the backroom dealings that has historically been going on between him and his ex-business partner, quote-unquote, and best friend, Thomas Havel. You know, the guy found guilty of embezzling €20 million. That brings us to the here and now. Zom Studio is a shell of what it used to be, milked for nearly every last dollar the studio could have generated. And none of the creative minds that worked for the studio, none of the people that began the Zom Cultural Association, and the creative minds behind the creation of the world of Elysium and its stories can ever be legally told again by its creator or anyone else who assisted in birthing it into the world. In fact, not only has the studio become a shell of its former self, but the cultural association that spurned Elysium itself has been completely dissolved. In a Medium article written in October of 2022, shortly after the firing of Rostov Kurvitz and Hinper, Martin Lugia, world builder and editor for Disco Elysium and secretary for the Zom Cultural Association, writes that the association no longer represented the ethos it was founded on, and most of the mistakes that were made were contingent, determined by the socio-cultural conditions they were thrown into. Gee, it sounds an awful lot like the management fucked it up. He signed it from the Tallinn Inpatient Treatment Psychiatry Clinic, Ward 9. I think anyone would agree that when you've spent nearly 2 decades of your life on cultivating something artistically fantastic, even if it's just to you and your friends, having that thing wrested from you has a toll. Remember when I said that Compass pulled a shiesty move in order to get the shares of ownership that he did? In October of 2022, shortly after the documentary was released, Compass was ordered by a judge to pay back €4.8 million that he had taken from the company. But in paying it back to the company, all he did was make the valuation of something that he owned higher. In essence, he was just paying back himself. Really nothing lost there. In February of 2024, just slightly more than a year ago as of the recording of this video, Zom laid off a quarter of its workforce, of which Argo Tulik and Dora Klinzich were a part of, and has now completely canceled any potential sequel to Disco Elysium, probably due to the fact that they worked tirelessly at alienating its creators from the company. But hey, that's just a guess. This studio was assisted into living at the hands of someone that had to stand before a court due to the potentiality of child porn in one of his books, invested in by someone who was best friends with and business partner of a man who was found guilty of embezzling 20 million euro, who fled the country in order to avoid paying his debts, who appointed that best friend as an executive producer of the IP, who knowingly paid 30 to 50,000 euro per month to a consulting firm owned by his best friend's lover, and who allowed his best friend and former business partner to, by all accounts, attempt to set the creative minds of Disco Elysium against each other, work up a false narrative about those creators.
Later, Robert said that he was played by Dennis. Like basically, his argument was that Dennis was using him in some ways.
Treat the female employees of the studio like garbage, and create this feedback loop to fire those creators from their positions, all while making solo backroom deals in order to gain majority shareholder status without the minority shareholders' knowledge, in order to milk those same creative minds behind Elysium, its stories, and its accolades for every penny they possibly could, because, and this is the only reason honestly I can think of why they would be so motivated to do so.
Fuck you, pay me.
Gee, I wonder why the studio failed. This unfortunately isn't a unique tale, although the spin on some of this stuff is completely fucking wild. Guys with money take advantage of creative minds that don't have the funds or business acumen to make a quality contract that allows them to retain control over that which they create, and they end up becoming the corporate equivalent of indentured servants. To date, Argo Tulik still cannot work on his project. The other creatives have started other studios away from Disco Elysium. Lawsuits are still pending, but there have been some settlements granted to Kurvitz, Rostov, and Hinpair in the interim that is estimated but unverified to be somewhere around 2 million euro. We will never see another Disco Elysium story ever again. Compass, and those still working for and in control of the Disco Elysium IP, do not possess the talent necessary to tell another Disco Elysium story, evident in the layoffs and the cancellation of the sequel. And the creative minds that brought characters like Harry into the world will never be able to tell another Elysium story for fear of being sued into the levels of poverty they had spent their lives trying to escape. I spent over a month researching, writing, and rewriting over and over again how I wanted this story to be delivered, and I find it oddly apt, as if ripped from the pages of a murder mystery. The unfortunate conclusion, the ultimate shame in all of this, is the future of Disco Elysium is dead, and the killers, the men firmly holding the smoking guns in their hands, are Ilmar Compass and Tanis Havel.